People ask me why I stayed in that small village in the middle of the Arizona desert. I always gave them the same answer. Because of the horse. It was the easiest answer I had, and like every easy answer, it was only half true. The other half of the truth is this. On the morning I planned to leave, I saw River standing alone before dawn, looking west like she was waiting for something to come and take her away. I recognized that posture, because I had been standing exactly like that for 8 months straight. That was the moment I knew I was not going anywhere. But the story does not begin there. It begins 3 months earlier when I was a wanted man. My horse was dying beneath me, and the only woman who could save him had just looked straight at my arrest warrant, then turned back to her work like nothing in the world had changed. My name is Jesse Calloway. I am 32 years old, and at the time this story begins, I had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in the better part of a year. Not because I could not find a safe place to lay my head, but because every time I closed my eyes long enough, I saw Daniel Reeves. Daniel Reeves was 34 years old. He had a wife named Clara and 2 boys, the older one barely tall enough to reach the fence rail of the small farm they kept outside of Flagstaff. He was not a criminal. He was not hiding anything dangerous in that farmhouse. He was a man who had bought his land, honest, worked it honest, and had the bad fortune of buying it in a county where a Pinkerton file clerk had made a clerical error and flagged his property as a known hideout for cattle thieves. I was the senior agent on the raid. Warren Holt was my partner. What happened that night I have told only twice in my life, once to a federal judge in Tucson and once to River Many Horses in the middle of an Arizona rainstorm. I will tell it once more here because you cannot understand why any of the rest of this story matters unless you understand what I was carrying when it began. Holt went through the back door. I took the front. The farmhouse was dark. I called out the identification the way procedure required. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Holt saw movement and fired before I could say another word. Daniel Reeves was holding a lantern. He had come to the door to see what the noise was about. He was dead before he hit the floor. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. I did not move. I did not shout for Holt to hold. I did not do anything at all. A man was dying 3 feet in front of me, and I stood there with my hand on a pistol. I never drew doing the mathematics of what this was going to cost us professionally, thinking about the report, thinking about the language we would use, thinking about everything except the only thing that mattered. Clara Reeves screamed from the back bedroom. The 2 boys started crying. I resigned from the Pinkerton agency the following morning. Holt did not. Instead, Holt filed a report that described the shooting as a necessary response to an armed threat. He listed me as the agent who fired. By the time I found out what the report said, there was a warrant with my name on it, and Holt had enough friends in enough offices to make sure it stuck. I ran. Not because I was guilty of pulling that trigger, but because I was guilty of something that does not have a clean legal name, and I was not entirely sure I deserved to fight my way out of it. That was 8 months before I walked into the Apache settlement in the hills north of Red Rock Junction, leading a dying horse and carrying a wanted poster in my coat pocket with my own face on it. His name was Dust. He was an Appaloosa 12 years old with a coat that looked like someone had spilled cream over dark river stone. I had bought him off a man in Colorado 3 years earlier for $40 and a promise to stop asking questions about where the horse had come from. He was not a young animal, and he was not a pretty one, but he was steady in a way that very few living things are steady, and in the years we had been together, he had carried me through 2 blizzards, 1 flash flood, and more miles of empty country than I cared to count. 3 years before I bought him, I had almost killed him. That is the part I never told people. The man I bought Dust from had run him half to death across rocky terrain, and when I first saw the animal, he was standing in a corral on 3 good legs with his head hanging low and every rib showing through his coat. The man told me the horse was done and offered to shoot him if I wanted to spare myself the trouble of waiting. I stood at that corral fence for a long time. Then I paid the $40. I do not fully understand why. I have thought about it many times since. I think it had something to do with the way Dust looked at me when I climbed through that fence rail. Not with hope. Animals in that kind of condition do not look at you with hope. He looked at me with something that was simply the absence of expectation. He was not asking me for anything. He had stopped asking. Something about that undid me completely. When dust went down in the canyon 3 days outside of Red Rock Junction, I knew before I even looked at the leg what I was dealing with. He had stepped wrong, coming down a loose shale slope, and the crack of it echoed off the rock walls like a rifle shot. By the time I got to him, he had already stopped trying to stand. He lay on his side, breathing in short, shallow pulls, and he looked up at me from the ground with his breathing shallow, and his bad leg already swelling, and there was nothing in his expression that could be called a request. He had simply stopped trying to stand and was letting what happened next be whatever it was going to be. I sat down on the ground next to him right there in the canyon. The sun was going down. I had a warrant in my pocket and a man named Holt somewhere behind me who had resources and grudges and no particular reason to let me keep breathing. The sensible thing would have been to leave the horse and keep moving. I thought about my mother then, Margaret Calloway, who had lost the family property when I was 19 years old to a land company that filed fraudulent paperwork in 3 different county offices and walked away with everything she had worked 20 years to build. She had stood in the doorway of that empty house with her hands folded in front of her and looked at me with an expression that I did not understand until much later. It was not grief. It was the look of a woman deciding what to do next. She had asked me one question. "What are you going to do with your life, Jesse?" I had joined the Pinkerton Agency because I wanted to be someone who protected people like her. People who had things taken from them by men with paperwork and power and no conscience. I had wanted to be the honest one, the one who showed up and made things right. Instead, I had become a tool of exactly the kind of men I had set out to oppose. And when the moment came where the honest thing and the safe thing were not the same thing, I had stood in a hallway and done the mathematics. I sat next to Dust in that canyon until the stars came out. Then I got up, found a way to rig a support for his leg with what I had in my saddlebags, and started walking north toward the hills where 2 different people in Red Rock Junction had mentioned, with the careful vagueness of people who are not sure whether they believe what they are saying, that there was an Apache woman who sometimes did things with injured animals that could not be easily explained. The infection had already started by the time I found her. The settlement was tucked into a fold of the hills that you would not see from the main trail, sheltered on 3 sides by red rock formations that caught the last of the evening light and held it long after the desert below had gone gray. I came in from the south moving slowly because Dust could not move any other way, and I had my hands visible before the first men stepped out to meet me. There were 3 of them, young and watchful, and they looked at me the way men look at a stranger who has arrived at a time and in a condition that raises more questions than it answers. I kept my hands up. I told them my horse needed help. I told them I was looking for River Many Horses. The name did something, not a dramatic thing, just a small shift in the way the oldest of the 3 held his shoulders. He looked at the other 2, then looked at me, then looked at Dust, who was standing with his head low and his bad leg barely touching the ground. He nodded toward the center of the settlement. I found her by following the light. There was a fire burning low near a structure at the far end of the settlement, and crouched beside it was a woman working on something I could not make out at first. As I got closer, I could see it was a dog, a medium-sized animal lying on its side, and she was doing something careful and deliberate to one of its rear legs. She did not look up when I approached. I stopped a few feet away and waited. Dust stood beside me. The fire crackled. The dog made a small sound, not a pained sound, more like an acknowledgement. The woman's hands kept moving. They were precise hands, economical, each movement arriving exactly where it needed to go and going no further. I watched those hands for several minutes, and somewhere in those minutes I forgot that I was a wanted man. I forgot that Warren Holt was somewhere in the territory behind me. I forgot the warrant in my pocket and the dead man in my dreams and all the miles of empty desert between where I was standing and any version of a life that made sense. For a few minutes I was just a man watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and I found that I could not look away. She finished. She sat back on her heels and looked at the dog for a moment, a long, assessing look, and then she stood up and turned to me for the first time. She was somewhere near my age, perhaps a few years younger, with dark eyes that caught the firelight and did not seem to need it. Her hair was pulled back from her face in a practical braid. She looked at Dust first, a long professional assessment that moved from his head, down his body, to the bad leg. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the warrant that was sticking out of my coat pocket. I had forgotten it was there. I reached for it instinctively, already forming some kind of explanation in my mind, already calculating how much of the truth I could afford to tell. She spoke before I could. "I see that paper," she said. Her English was clear and unhurried, with a cadence that was not quite like anything I had heard before. Her voice carried no judgment and no warmth, which turned out to be one of the most clarifying things anyone had said to me in months. Then she said, "The horse still needs help the same way." She turned back to Dust and crouched down next to his bad leg. And that was the end of the conversation about the warrant. She examined the leg in silence for what seemed like a very long time. I stood and watched. Dust stood and let himself be examined with a patience that I found oddly moving. When she finally stood up, she did not look at me right away. She looked at Dust for another moment, and there was something in that look that I recognized without being able to name the look of someone who has made a decision that they know will cost them something. "The infection is deep," she said. "One more day, and it would have been past the point where I could help. But I can save him." I breathed for what felt like the first time in 3 days. "How much?" I asked. She shook her head. "I do not take money. The treatment will take 3 months. You will stay here and work for me during that time. Transporting injured animals, preparing medicines, the heavy work that I cannot do alone." I said yes without thinking about it. Dust needed me to say yes, and so I said it. She looked at me then with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite suspicion. "There is another problem," she said. I waited. She told me about the custom. An unmarried woman could not have an unmarried man living and working beside her in the settlement. It went against the traditions of her community, and her community was not something she was willing to compromise for the sake of convenience. There were 2 options, she said. I could leave and find help elsewhere, or we could find a solution that satisfied the community's requirements. I already knew what she was going to say before she said it. I had enough experience reading people to see the shape of it coming. "A paper marriage," she said, "a formal arrangement to satisfy the rules. We would live in separate structures. I would work with her until Dust was completely healed. After that, we would each go our separate ways, and the arrangement would be dissolved." She said it with the directness of someone reading a contract aloud, each clause delivered flat and clear. She looked at me steadily while she said it, and I could see that she was prepared for me to refuse or to argue or to try to negotiate something different. I looked at Dust. He was standing with his head low and his eyes half closed, and in that moment he looked exactly like he had looked 3 years ago in that Colorado corral when he had stopped asking anything of anyone and was simply waiting to see what got decided. "When is the ceremony?" I said. Something moved across her face, fast and small, gone before I could identify it with any certainty. She had not expected a quick answer. That much was clear. "Tomorrow at dawn," she said, "but I want you to understand something first. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Do not expect anything from me except the treatment for your horse." "Understood," I said. "And you should not expect anything from me except hard work." She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and told me to help her move Dust to the recovery area. We needed to start treatment that night. The fever had to come down before morning or things would get significantly more complicated. We worked together in the firelight for several hours. She did not speak except to give instructions, and I followed them without asking for explanations. Somewhere around midnight, Dust's breathing began to even out. River sat back and looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to her structure without a word, and the night was quiet. I sat beside Dust until he was fully asleep. I thought about the strangeness of what I had agreed to. In a matter of hours, I would be married to a woman whose last name I had only just learned in a ceremony I did not understand, in a community I had arrived in as an outsider and a wanted man. I thought about Daniel Reeves and his 2 boys and the lantern he had been carrying when Holt's bullet found him. I thought about my mother standing in an empty doorway asking me what I was going to do with my life. I did not have an answer for her then. I was not sure I had one now, but I looked at Dust sleeping in the firelight, his breathing slow and steady for the first time in days, and I thought at least this one thing. At least this. Dawn in the Arizona desert arrives with a kind of violence that people from other places do not expect. It does not ease in gently. It comes all at once, the sky going from black to deep purple to a hard burning orange in the space of 20 minutes, and the heat arrives with it like a door opening onto a furnace. I had not slept. I had spent the night beside Dust, sitting with my back against the fence rail, watching the stars wheel overhead, and thinking about all the ways a man can arrive somewhere he never intended to go. By the time the light began to change, I had reached a state that was not quite alertness and not quite exhaustion, but something in between, the particular clearness of mind that comes when you have been awake long enough for all the noise to quiet down. River was already at work when I found her in the early light. She was preparing something in a clay bowl, grinding dried plant material with a smooth stone, her movements steady and unhurried. She did not acknowledge my arrival, but she shifted slightly to make room at the low table she was working on, and I took that as an invitation to sit. "We will meet with Old Thorn and the council at sunrise," she said without looking up from her work. "It will be brief. Afterwards you will have your daily tasks." I noticed she had already moved to the next stage of things without revisiting the previous night's conversation. There was no checking in, no, "Are you still certain about this?" She had asked me once, I had answered, and she had accepted that as sufficient. I found that I respected it, even as I was aware that what I had answered was not entirely honest. The truth about why I agreed to stay the truth. I offered only to the darkness that night beside the fence rail was this: I had agreed because Dust needed me to agree. That part was entirely real. But underneath it, in the place where honest things live when you are not ready to say them out loud, I had also agreed because this settlement in the folds of those red hills was the first place in 8 months where someone had looked at my arrest warrant and simply kept working. River Many Horses had seen the paper and made a decision that the paper was not the most important fact in front of her. After 8 months of being defined by that warrant everywhere I went, the experience of being seen past it was something I did not have a clean name for. I told myself it was strategic. A Pinkerton's man on the run thinks in practical terms. This settlement was off the main trails. Holt would not look for me here. 3 months was enough time to organize the evidence I had been collecting and find a way to get it to someone with the authority to act on it. I told myself all of that, and it was all true, and none of it was the whole truth, and I knew it even then. Old Thorn was already seated when we arrived at the central fire. He was an older man with the kind of face that has been shaped by decades of making difficult decisions and living with the ones that turned out to be wrong. He sat very straight, and he watched me approach with eyes that held the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to observe first and conclude later. There were 2 other men seated beside him, elders of similar age, and they watched me with the same careful stillness. River stood beside me. She had changed into clean clothes, leather pants, and a cotton shirt. Her hair braided back the same way it always was. She had not made any concession to the occasion beyond being clean. Neither had I. I was still in the same dusty clothes I had ridden in with, because they were the only clothes I had that were clean enough to be presentable, which was not a high bar. Old Thorn spoke in his own language first. River translated not everything, just the essential parts. He was asking me if I understood what this arrangement meant. He was telling me that among his people the institution of marriage was not taken lightly, even when the circumstances were irregular. He was asking me to confirm that I intended to behave with respect toward his community and toward River Many Horses for the duration of my stay. I said that I did. He looked at me for a long moment after I said it, not with suspicion exactly, with the attention of a man who is reading something more than the surface of what he is being told. He said one word in his language. River said Calloway, not a question, not an exclamation. Just the name said the way you say a name when it has arrived where you expected it. I felt the floor shift slightly under my feet. Many people have that name, I said. Old Thorn looked at me with an expression that did not change and did not need to. He nodded once very slowly, and then he began to speak the words of the ceremony. It was brief. There was no music and no flowers and no assembled crowd. A few people from the settlement had gathered at a respectful distance, but they stayed back and did not intrude on the small circle of the fire. The words Old Thorn spoke were simple and clear and carried the weight of something that has been said in that form for a very long time by people who meant it. River and I stood side by side. We did not look at each other during the ceremony. I looked at Old Thorn. I do not know where River looked. When it came time to mark the document, we both bent over the paper that one of the elders held, and I watched my own handwriting produce the name Jesse Calloway in a context that my life had not prepared me for in any particular way. Old Thorn said, "It is complete." I had imagined my own wedding in the abstract way that young men sometimes imagine things that seem distant enough to be safe to think about. None of those imagined versions looked anything like this. In none of them had the woman beside me failed to look at me once during the entire ceremony. But when Old Thorn said those words, River finally looked up. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She looked at me directly with an expression I could not read. Something complicated living behind those dark eyes, and then she looked away, and the moment was gone. I did not understand what that look meant. It would be a long time before I did. After the ceremony, River walked with me to the structure that had been prepared for my use. It was small and clean, set close enough to hers to be practical for working purposes, but positioned with the clear intention of maintaining a boundary between 2 separate spaces. She stood in the doorway and told me the rules. Her structure was her own. I did not enter it without an explicit invitation. I did not ask her personal questions. I did not interfere with her work unless she specifically asked for my involvement. Every morning at first light, we would check on all the animals under treatment together. I would prepare medicines according to her instructions exactly as she specified, with no improvisation. When injured animals needed to be transported from other locations, that was my responsibility. She said all of this with the efficiency of someone who has given similar instructions before and knows from experience that clarity at the beginning saves considerable trouble later. I said I understood. She turned to go. She stopped. "One more thing," she said without turning back. "I do not care what you have done outside of this place. That is not my concern. But while you are here, you will not cause harm to anyone in this community." "Agreed," I said. "And you will not lie to me." She said it simply, without emphasis, as if it were an obvious enough condition that it barely needed to be spoken. She still had not turned around to look at me. I looked at the back of her head and the straight line of her shoulders, and I said, "Agreed." She walked away. I stood in the doorway of my new structure and listened to the settlement coming to life around me in the morning light, the particular sounds of a community beginning its day, and I thought about the 2 words I had just spoken. I had agreed not to lie to her. And I had been lying to her in the way that omission is a kind of lying since the moment I arrived. Not about the warrant. She knew about the warrant. Old Thorn had seen to that. What I was lying about was the reason I had agreed to the arrangement so quickly the night before. I had stood beside Dust and looked at him and said, "When is the ceremony?" And I had let her believe, because it was easier to let her believe it, that the answer had only ever been about the horse. I sat down on the low bed in that small, clean room and looked at the wall for a while. The sound of the settlement moved around me like water. Outside somewhere I could hear Dust shifting in his enclosure, the particular sound of him settling his weight in the way he did when he was comfortable enough to rest. I pulled the warrant out of my pocket. I had folded it many times over the months following the same creases until they were worn almost through. I opened it and looked at my own name printed across the top of it in official lettering, and then I looked at the bottom of the page and I stopped. In the lower right corner of the warrant in ink that was a slightly different color from the printing, someone had written 4 words in a handwriting that was not official type, but the cramped, fast script of a man writing in a hurry. Red Rock Junction, heading north. I sat very still. I turned the paper over. There was nothing on the back. I looked at the words again. Red Rock Junction was the last town I had stopped in before coming north toward the settlement. I had stopped there to let Dust drink from the town well. It had been crowded at midday, the well was in the center of a public square, and I had been careful but not careful enough to be invisible. The writing was not on the original warrant. The paper around those words was slightly different in texture, as if it had been handled many times while the ink was fresh and then dried in someone's pocket. This was a note, a field note, written by someone watching me at that well and slipped into my coat pocket in the press of the crowd, or perhaps dropped into my saddlebag without me noticing. Someone had been tracking me at Red Rock Junction and reporting my movements, someone who worked for Holt, which meant Holt knew the direction I had gone when I left town. I sat in that small room as the morning light shifted and thought about the geometry of the situation. From Red Rock Junction there were 3 directions a man on a horse could go that made sense. Holt would have to search all 3. That bought some time, but not unlimited time, not the kind of time I had been casually assuming I had. I had walked into this settlement thinking it was a place to disappear for 3 months. Instead, I had walked in carrying a trail marker in my coat pocket, and I had not even known it was there. I looked at the words again. Heading north. I thought about the settlement around me, about River working with her medicines in the early light, about Old Thorn and his slow, careful attention, about the people who had gathered at a respectful distance to witness a ceremony that I had agreed to under conditions I had not been entirely honest about. I had brought something dangerous here, not intentionally, but the intentions of a man in motion do not change what he leaves behind him when he moves through a place. I put the warrant back in my pocket. I folded it along the old creases. I sat with it for a moment longer. Then I got up and went to check on Dust because that was the first task of the morning, and because the work was what I had. It was what I had always had, and in the absence of anything else that was solid, it was enough to begin with. Dust was standing at the fence rail when I reached him, his head up, watching me approach. His bad leg was still clearly sore, but he was bearing weight on it in a way he had not been able to do the day before. River's treatment had begun to work already. He watched me come through the gate with those steady, patient eyes, and I put my hand on his neck and stood there with him for a while in the early light. The settlement was awake around us. I could hear the morning sounds of a community beginning its work. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a fire was being built up from its coals. Somewhere in a structure close enough to walk to, in 30 seconds a woman was grinding medicines with a smooth stone and thinking whatever she thought about and not telling anyone what it was. I had told her I would not lie to her. I had said it like it was a simple thing, the way agreements sound simple when you are making them and complicated when you have to live inside them. Warren Holt was somewhere in the territory behind me. He had resources and determination and very good reasons to make sure I never reached a courtroom. I had walked into this settlement thinking I was hiding, and instead I had written the address on the envelope. I did not know yet what I was going to do about any of that. But I knew one thing standing there with my hand on Dust's neck in the Arizona morning. I had said I would not lie to her. That meant eventually I was going to have to tell her the truth. The first week passed, the way first weeks pass when you are learning a new language. Not the spoken kind, though that was part of it too. The language, I mean, is the one that belongs to a particular place and the people who have lived inside it long enough to stop noticing it. The rhythm of when fires get built and when they go quiet. The particular silence that falls over a community at midday when the heat becomes serious. The way certain paths through the settlement are used by certain people at certain times, not by rule, but by the accumulated habit of years. I was not good at it immediately. I am not sure I was even good at it by the end. But I learned to pay attention, which is the first requirement, and I learned to move through spaces without asserting myself into them, which is the second, and those two things together kept me from causing the kind of friction that a stranger can cause in a tight community without meaning to. River taught by example. That was her method, and once I understood it was her method and not some particular coldness toward me, specifically, I found it easier to receive. She would do a thing slowly enough that it could be observed, and then she would move to the next thing. If I reproduced what I had seen correctly, she would continue. If I reproduced it incorrectly, she would do it again, the same slowness, the same patience, until I got it right. She almost never used words to correct me. This was, I came to understand, not curtness, but efficiency. Words take time and carry imprecision. A demonstration is exact. I learned to identify 43 different plants by sight and smell and texture within the first 2 weeks. I learned how to prepare poultices for infected tissue, how to reduce swelling in a leg joint with cold water compresses applied in specific intervals, how to immobilize a fracture in a large animal using materials that weighed almost nothing and held like iron when they were applied correctly. I had spent 6 years as a detective learning to read people, and before that I had spent most of my life learning to work hard and ask few questions, and both of those skills turned out to be useful in ways I had not expected. What I was slower to learn was how to read River herself. I had thought at first that she was simply a private person, someone who had arranged her interior life behind a door she kept closed. That was part of it. But the fuller picture was more specific than that. River Manyhorses had organized herself around a single principle that was so deeply built into her daily existence that it had become invisible to her the way a foundation is invisible once the house is standing on it. The principle was control. Not the controlling kind that means domination over others. The other kind, the kind that lives inside a person and governs everything outward from there. She controlled her environment by being better at her work than any possible circumstance could overwhelm. She controlled her schedule by arriving earlier than necessary and staying later than required. She controlled her relationships by keeping them at a professional distance where needs were clear and expectations were limited, and disappointment had a smaller surface area to land on. I recognized it because I had been doing a version of the same thing for 8 months, and a less sophisticated version for years before that. What I noticed in the spaces between tasks in the margins of the working day was the cost of it. Every evening after the last of the day's treatments were completed and the medicines were prepared for the morning, River would sit at the edge of the settlement and look west. She sat alone, and she sat very still, and the light would go through all its colors around her, and she would not move through any of them. Once on the 4th day I was close enough to see that her shoulders were shaking slightly, not dramatically, not in the way that would have announced itself as distress, just a small private trembling that stopped after a minute and left no visible trace. I did not go to her. It was not my place, and I knew it. But I also did not leave. I stood where I was at enough distance that she could not see me watching, and I stayed there until her shoulders went still. Then I went back to my own structure by a longer route. That was the first thing I did for her that she did not know about. I have thought about it many times since, whether it was an intrusion or something else. I still do not have a clean answer. What I know is that standing there felt necessary in a way I could not explain and did not try to. On the 6th day I encountered Silas. He was River's younger brother by adoption, brought into the family when he was a child, and River was already established enough in the community's eyes to be a fixed point. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with quick eyes and the particular energy of someone who has spent years being slightly faster than necessary in order to keep up with the person ahead of them. He was not hostile to me in the open way that announces itself as hostility. He was watchful. He asked questions that sounded casual and were not. He positioned himself in spaces where he could observe without appearing to observe. He was running surveillance on me the way a man runs surveillance when he has decided he needs information but has not yet decided what to do with it. What I understood about Silas, I understood from a single scene that I was not supposed to witness. It was the afternoon of the 6th day, and I was returning from the eastern edge of the settlement where I had been repairing a section of fence. I came back through the treatment area by habit, and I stopped when I saw that Silas was there with a small foal that had caught its leg in a rope and badly wrenched the knee joint. He was working on it carefully and correctly. I could see that much from where I stood. He had clearly been taught the right technique. His hands knew what they were doing. But the foal would not settle. It kept shifting its weight, kept trying to pull back from him. Not out of pain exactly, but out of something more like uncertainty. The animal unable to find in his hands the particular quality of assurance it needed in order to trust what was happening to it. River came into the treatment area from the other direction. She did not hurry. She came at the same pace she always moved at, steady and deliberate, and she crouched beside the foal without speaking to Silas or acknowledging the situation as a problem. She placed her hand on the animal's neck, not pressing, just resting there with the weight of complete attention behind it. The foal went still within 30 seconds. River checked the knee joint, made one small adjustment to what Silas had done, and then she stood up and walked away to the next task. Silas sat back on his heels. He looked at his own hands for a moment. It was a brief thing, and if I had not been paying the kind of attention I was paying, I might not have seen it at all. Then he stood up and walked away in the opposite direction from River, and his walk was a fraction too deliberate, the walk of a man making sure his walk looks normal. I stood where I was until both of them were gone. Then I went to check on Dust and thought about what I had seen. Silas did not hate me. I had been reading it as a kind of territorial hostility, the suspicion of an insider toward an outsider who has arrived without warning into a space the insider considers his own. And that was part of it. But it was not the whole of it. The whole of it was older and ran deeper and had nothing to do with me specifically. He was living in the shadow of someone who was very good at a thing he was only adequately good at, and she was his sister, and there was no clean resolution to that because it was not a problem that could be solved by working harder or learning more. Some people have a quality in their hands that cannot be taught. River had it. Silas had been watching her have it since he was old enough to notice such things, and it had been costing him something for a very long time. I understood the specific loneliness of that. Not the shadow part, but the part where you have spent so many years measuring yourself against someone else's standard that you have lost track of where your own standard is. Later that week, Silas sat near me while I was repairing a section of gate mechanism, and he asked me what I had done before I came here. The question was casual and was not casual. I was a detective, I told him. He thought about that. You tracked people down sometimes. Sometimes I was trying to find information rather than people. And sometimes I was looking for the person who had done a thing that had been blamed on someone else. He was quiet for a while. Did you always find what you were looking for? No, I said. I found out what I was looking for wasn't always the same thing as what I actually needed to find. He looked at me sideways, trying to determine if I was making a point about him specifically. I was not. Or if I was, it was not an intentional one. River says he started and then stopped. I waited. River says the best healers are not the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who pay attention when they do. Is that what she told you? I said. He picked up a piece of the gate mechanism I had set aside and turned it over in his hands. She tells me a lot of things. He paused. She's usually right. That's its own kind of problem. I thought about what to say to that. I settled on, I imagine it would be. He set the piece of metal down. He looked out across the settlement without appearing to look at anything in particular. Then he stood up and went back to whatever he had been doing, and I let him go. 2 days after that conversation, I saw him at the edge of the settlement talking to a man I had not seen before. The man was dressed well for the territory. Not the expensive dress of someone who did not know the conditions, but the purposeful dress of someone who had made practical choices with money behind them. His boots were good. His horse, which was tied at a respectful distance, was better than good. He stood in the way that men stand when they are accustomed to being met halfway, to having conversations come to them rather than having to go toward the conversations. He and Silas spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. I watched from across the settlement, doing nothing that would indicate I was watching. The man turned at one point, and his face caught the afternoon light. He was perhaps 50, with a broad, steady face and gray at the temples, and the particular expression of a man who has found that patience is more effective than urgency, and has organized his entire approach to the world around that discovery. I did not know him, but I knew the type in the way that 6 years of field work teaches you to know types. He was not a rancher, and he was not a trader, and he was not a government man, or he was all of those things in the way that a certain kind of man is all of those things while being primarily something else. When he left, Silas stood watching him go for a longer moment than was necessary. Then he turned back toward the settlement, and his eyes moved across the space in a sweep that was practiced and casual and landed briefly on me before moving on. I kept my face neutral and went back to my work. That evening I sat outside with Dust for a while after the day's tasks were done. The desert was doing the thing it does at evening, where the cooling air releases all the heat the rock has been storing, and it comes up at you from the ground in waves that carry the smell of dry earth and something older underneath it. The sky was going through its colors, the same violence of orange and purple that had greeted me on my first morning here, and I sat with my back against the fence rail and let the day settle out of my muscles. I thought about the man at the edge of the settlement. I thought about the way Silas had watched him leave. I thought about Warren Holt and the note in my pocket. Red Rock Junction, heading north. I thought about the geometry of the territory and how many days it would take a man with resources to narrow the direction down. I thought about what it meant to have brought a trail marker into a place where other people were living their lives without any knowledge of what I had walked in carrying. I had not told River about the note. I had told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The honest version of that was that I did not know how to tell her without also telling her everything else, and everything else was a weight I had been carrying alone for so long that the idea of setting it down in front of someone felt more frightening than continuing to carry it. Dust pressed his nose against my shoulder. I put my hand up and held it there. "You're better at this than I am," I told him. He did not argue with that assessment. The storm came on a Thursday, which I know because I had been keeping a rough count of days in my head, and Thursday was the 41st day since I arrived at the settlement. Arizona does not get heavy rain often, but when it decides to, it does not do the thing halfway. The clouds had been building to the south since mid-afternoon, the kind of building that announces itself with a specific quality of stillness in the air, a held-breath feeling, and by early evening the lightning was walking down the hills on the far side of the valley in slow, deliberate steps. I had made sure all the animals in the treatment area were secure before dark. It was a habit by then, the evening check, something I did automatically the way a person checks a door before sleeping. Dust was in the covered enclosure at the far end, his leg continuing to improve in the slow, steady way of things that are healing correctly rather than quickly. I had given him an extra ration of feed and checked his water twice and told him to stay put, which he regarded with the mild contempt that it deserved. The wind came first, the way it always does. It moved through the settlement from the south, and it moved fast, pulling at the edges of everything, finding the loose places. I was inside my own structure when I heard it pick up, and I came out to check on the treatment area again, and that was when I heard the sound from River's direction. It was not a shout. It was the sound of something structural giving way, a series of cracks followed by a heavier impact, and then silence. And then the rain arrived all at once, like a decision being made. I ran. Her structure had taken a corner post failure. The roof had not come down completely, but one side had buckled under the weight of the water collecting in the canvas, and that side had pulled the wall with it, and River was in the wreckage of it trying to save her medicines. She was working in the rain and the mud with the methodical focus of someone who has decided to do a thing and will not be deterred by conditions, pulling clay pots and glass containers and wrapped parcels of dried plant material out of the collapsed section and stacking them in her arms with no system except urgency. "Leave it," I said. She did not look up. "I cannot leave this. Some of these cannot be replaced. The plants do not grow close enough to gather again before we would need them." I looked at what she was holding and what was still in the rubble and made a fast calculation. "We can come back for the rest. Get what you're holding and come with me." She kept moving. I stepped into the collapse with her. The footing was bad wet canvas and broken pole mixed with mud, and the rain was serious now, the kind that makes it difficult to hear a person standing 2 feet away. I started moving the larger pieces of debris off the containers that were still buried, working fast, and River worked beside me without acknowledging that I was there, which, under the circumstances, I chose to interpret as acceptance. We pulled out what we could in perhaps 5 minutes. Then the remaining section of the roof shifted in a way that suggested it was making decisions of its own. "Now," I said, and I took her arm. She started to pull back. "There are still 3 more jars." I held on. "I am not losing you to a collapsed roof over 3 jars of medicine." She looked at me then directly for a fraction of a second in the rain and the dark. Then she let me lead her out. My structure was the larger of the two, and it had been built with better materials at the corner posts, which was one of the first things I had fixed when I arrived. We came inside dripping water in quantities that made the word wet seem insufficient, and I lit the lamp and found the extra blanket I kept folded on the chest and handed it to her without preamble. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around. It was the first time she had been inside my structure. I became aware of it all at once, the specific quality of exposure that comes when someone sees the space you live in without the filter of intentional presentation. I had not arranged anything. The room was clean but not staged. There were the objects of daily function, the tools and the work materials, and the things that accumulate when a person is somewhere long enough for accumulation to begin. And there was the small collection of photographs I had placed face down on the chest along the wall. And there were the letters. I had written to my mother 3 times since arriving at the settlement drafts that I had not sent because sending required going into town, and going into town meant exposure. They were folded and stacked on the corner of the table where I worked. River looked at them but said nothing. She looked at the photographs. She did not ask, but she looked. I picked up the top photograph and turned it over and set it flat on the table where she could see it. Daniel Reeves stood in front of a small wood frame structure that I recognized from the case file as the outbuilding adjacent to his farmhouse. He was squinting slightly into the sun. He looked like a man who spent most of his time outdoors, which he had been. "I carry it to remember his face," I said. River looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she sat down on the bench along the wall, still wrapped in the blanket, and she was quiet. The storm moved around us outside. It was serious weather, the kind that reshapes things, and the sounds it made against the walls of the structure were the sounds of large forces in motion, wind and water, and the creak of the settlement's materials under pressure. Inside the lamp made a small, steady light. River said, "The man in the photograph. Tell me what happened." I had not intended to tell it that night. I had been managing the information carefully, dispensing it in portions that felt manageable, keeping the center of it to myself. But there was something about the storm outside, and the lamp inside, and the matter-of-fact directness of her request that made the management feel beside the point. I told her about Daniel Reeves. All of it. The case file error, the raid, the hallway, the lantern, the sound Clara Reeves made from the back bedroom. I told it in the same flat voice I had used when I rehearsed it in my head during the long nights on the trail, because that was the only voice I had for it, and I told it without stopping or revising or adding the softening language that a person sometimes reaches for when they want to make something easier to hear. River listened without interrupting. She sat with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on me, and she listened the way some people listen, with her whole self pointed at what was being said, not waiting for the end so she could respond, but actually inside the words as they arrived. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The man who fired the shot, he is the one who is looking for you." "Yes, because you are the only witness who can say what actually happened." "Yes." She thought about that. "What do you have against him, in terms of evidence?" I had a notebook. 6 years of Pinkerton work had made me a meticulous recorder of information, not because anyone required it, but because I had learned early that memory is selective in ways that tend to favor what a person already believes. I had kept detailed notes throughout the Daniel Reeves case notes that Holt did not know existed because I had kept them separate from the official file. After I left the agency, I had spent months gathering additional materials, affidavits from other agents who had been present in adjacent capacities, financial records that showed Holt had been receiving payments from the land company whose clerical error had generated the false flag on Reeves's property in the first place. The notebook was in my saddlebag. It was the most important thing I owned, and I had not mentioned it to anyone since arriving at the settlement. "I have enough to put him in prison," I said, "if I can get it to the right person." River looked at the folded letters on the corner of my table. "A federal judge in Tucson. There is a judge there named Harrison, who has a reputation for being genuinely independent. If I can get the notebook to him with a full account of what it contains. Holt does not have enough reach to suppress it." She was quiet again. Then, "Why haven't you gone to Tucson?" "Because going to Tucson means going through open territory where Holt has people," I said, and until dust is healed enough to carry me at speed, I am not mobile enough to take that risk. That was the practical answer, and it was a true answer. It was not the whole answer. The whole answer involved the particular paralysis of a man who has been running long enough that stopping feels like a skill he has lost, but I did not say that part. River looked at me steadily. I notice you said until dust is healed, not until the 3 months are finished. I looked back at her. She was right that those were not the same thing, and she was right to notice it, and I did not have a clean answer for why I had said it the way I had. She let it go. She looked at the photograph of Daniel Reeves. "Do you know the difference between guilt and responsibility?" she asked. Her voice had gone quieter than usual, the way it did when she was saying something she had thought about for a long time before saying it. I considered that. I'm not sure I do. Guilt is what you carry to punish yourself. Responsibility is what you carry to change something. She paused. They feel similar from the inside, but one of them is useful and one of them is just weight. I looked at her. After a moment I said, "Which one am I carrying?" She looked back at me with an expression I could not fully read. "That's the question, isn't it?" We sat with that for a while. The storm made its sounds around us, and the lamp held its small circle of light, and I thought about Daniel Reeves and the lantern he was holding, and the mathematics I had done in that hallway, and I tried to hold still inside the question she had asked me without grabbing for an answer that felt better than the truth. River said, "My father died 5 years ago. He was the leader here before Old Thorn. He died of an illness that arrived in the summer and was finished with him before the summer was over. There was nothing to fight, nothing to blame. It was simply a fact that the world produced and then moved on from." She looked at the lamp. "People thought I was strong afterward. They saw me continue working, and they interpreted that as strength. I let them interpret it that way because it was easier than explaining the truth, which was that I kept working because it was the only thing I knew how to do that didn't require me to feel what I was actually feeling." I said, "What were you actually feeling?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she was not going to answer. Then, terrified. I was terrified of what it meant that the one person who had ever fully understood what I was doing and why was gone, and I was terrified that if I stopped moving long enough to feel it properly, I would discover that I did not know how to be any of this without him watching. She said it without drama, the way she said most things, as a fact being reported rather than an emotion being performed. That made it more devastating, not less. I did not say anything in response. There was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than what she had just offered, and I had learned enough by that point to know the difference between a response that serves the person speaking and a response that serves the person listening. We sat in the storm for a long time after that. The conversation moved through other things. Lighter things, the kind of talk that happens when two people have gone somewhere deep together and need to find their way back to the surface gradually. She asked me about the work I had done before the Pinkerton years, and I told her about the territory and the different kinds of country I had moved through, and she told me about the settlement's history in that landscape, the particular knowledge of specific places that accumulates over generations of paying close attention to the same ground. At some point, the storm began to ease. The sound of it pulled back from the walls, and the quality of silence it left behind was different from the silence before the rain, heavier and cleaner, at the same time the way the air goes after something large has moved through it. River said I should check the treatment area. I got up and got my coat. We went out together into the aftermath of the storm, the ground dark and wet, the sky beginning to clear at its edges. The treatment area had held. Dust was dry in his covered enclosure, looking at us with the mild interest of an animal who had spent the storm in comfort and was willing to be sympathetic about whatever had happened to everyone else. We checked each animal in turn. Everything was intact. When we were finished, River stood for a moment in the cleared space of the treatment area looking at the sky. The stars were coming back, appearing in the gaps the clouds were leaving behind. "Thank you," she said, "for the shelter." I said, "Thank you for trusting me with it." She looked at me then in the way she had looked at me during the ceremony, that direct, complicated, briefly open look. Then she walked back toward the settlement. I stood where I was until she was out of sight. Then I turned to Dust, who was watching me with his hay-chewing expression of patient judgment. "I know," I said. "I'm aware." He chewed. The following morning I needed to speak to Silas. I found him before breakfast, which was intentional. People are less guarded before breakfast than at any other time of day, a fact that 6 years of investigative work had made very clear to me. He was sitting outside his structure looking at the storm damage with the expression of a man calculating how much work was ahead of him. I sat down near him without preamble. "The man you were talking to 2 days ago at the edge of the settlement," I said. "I need to know who he is." Silas went still in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and is not entirely surprised it has arrived. "He is a business contact," Silas said. "I have been trying to develop trading relationships with some of the towns to the east. He is someone who can help facilitate that." I looked at him. "What does he want in exchange?" Silas looked at the ground between his feet. He said he could handle certain logistical things. In exchange, he needed some information. What kind of information? Silas did not answer immediately. He picked up a small piece of broken wood from the storm damage and turned it in his hands. He asked whether there was a man staying here, whether he had arrived recently, whether he had a horse. I waited. I told him that a man had arrived, Silas said quietly, that he had been here for about 6 weeks. I told him the direction he had come from. The piece of wood turned in his hands. "I did not know," he said. "I did not know who this man was working for. I thought it was genuinely just information for trade logistics. People ask about travelers through the territory. It is not unusual." I listened to the rest of it in silence. The man had told Silas that in exchange for this information and any future information about my movements, he would help Silas establish trading relationships that Old Thorn and River had been reluctant to approve because they considered Silas too inexperienced. He had offered Silas the thing Silas most wanted, which was to be seen as capable independently of his sister's reputation. Silas had taken the offer. I sat with that for a moment. There was anger available if I wanted it. I did not particularly want it. Anger at Silas was a clean emotion, and this was not a clean situation. "The man is employed by someone who wants me dead," I said. "Not arrested. Dead. He will not stop with me." Silas looked up. "If Holt gets what he wants from me," I said carefully, "there is nothing preventing him from deciding that anyone who saw me here is a potential witness. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Silas's face changed. "He is not a business contact," I said. "He is the instrument of a man who has already killed one person to protect himself. What you told him I cannot undo, but I need to know everything. What questions he asked, what you told him, what he told you about where to reach him again." Silas put the piece of wood down. He looked across the settlement toward River's structure where the collapsed section of roof was visible in the morning light. He told me everything. By the time he was finished, I had a clear picture. Holt knew I was here. He knew roughly how long I had been here and that my horse had been injured. What he did not know, because Silas had not known to tell him, was about the notebook, or the evidence it contained, or the letters to the federal judge in Tucson that I had drafted but not sent. He also did not know that River had seen the arrest warrant from the beginning and chosen to look past it. But he was coming. The man at the edge of the settlement was a scout, and Holt did not send scouts unless he intended to follow them. I looked at Silas. He was young, and he had made a bad decision for reasons that were not entirely ignoble, and now he was sitting with the weight of what that decision had cost. I said, "I am going to need your help fixing this." He looked at me. He did not argue or deflect. He said, "What do you need?" That was the moment I decided Silas was going to be all right. Not because he had not made the mistake, but because he was not trying to make the mistake smaller than it was. That evening I went to River's structure and stood at the entrance and said her name. She looked up from her work. "There is something I need to tell you," I said. "All of it, including the parts I have been carrying alone." She set down what she was holding. She looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. "Come in," she said. I went in, and I told her everything. There is a particular quality to the weeks that follow a confession. I do not mean the legal kind, the formal kind that happens in front of judges and witnesses and gets recorded in official language that scrubs the humanity out of it. I mean the other kind, the kind that happens at night in a small room when you decide to stop managing what another person knows about you and simply let them know it. The quality I am describing is lightness, not happiness exactly, not the resolution of anything in particular, just the specific lightness of a weight that has been redistributed, shared between two people instead of carried by one, and the strange way that making something real by speaking it aloud changes the texture of every ordinary moment that comes after. River listened to everything. She sat across from me in her structure with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened the way she had listened through the storm, with her full attention given to what was being said rather than to what she was going to say in response. I told her about the note in my pocket. I told her about Silas and the scout, and what Silas had reported back to Holt's man. I told her about the notebook in my saddlebag and what it contained, and what it would mean if I could get it to the right person in Tucson. I told her that I had known since my second night in the settlement that Holt was coming, and that I had not told her, and that this was the clearest violation of the promise I had made her, and I was not going to dress it up as anything other than what it was. She did not respond immediately when I finished. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, letting it settle before she moved. Then she said, "You have been carrying this alone because telling me meant telling me all of it." Yes, and telling me all of it meant admitting that you came here carrying something dangerous without disclosing it. Yes. She was quiet again. Then, "How long before he arrives?" "I do not know," I said. "The scout reported my location approximately 2 weeks ago. Holt is methodical. He will take time to organize. But he will not take unlimited time." River stood up. She moved to the far side of her structure where she kept the materials for her work, and she stood there with her back to me for a moment, not doing anything with her hands, just standing. When she turned around, her expression had settled into the practical directness that I had come to recognize as the face she put on when she had made a decision and was moving toward executing it. "You need to get the notebook to Tucson," she said. "Yes." "Can you go and come back before he arrives?" "I do not know. Tucson is 3 days' ride. 6 days round trip, assuming I can get an audience with the judge quickly. It is not certain. Then we need to make it certain," she said, "or we need another way." We talked for a long time that evening about the geometry of it. River was practical in the way that people are practical when they have spent their lives solving problems that do not come with instructions, working through the variables without drama, identifying what was fixed and what could be moved. By the end of the conversation, we had not solved the problem, but we had mapped its edges, which is sometimes the most useful first step. What I remember most about that evening is not the strategy of it. It is the moment near the end when River stood up to prepare tea and moved past the table where I was sitting, and her hand came down briefly on my shoulder, not stopping, not pressing, just landing there for the duration of a single step and then lifting away. She did not acknowledge that she had done it. She kept moving to the fire, and she built it up, and she put the water on. I sat very still and looked at the wall. The weeks that followed that conversation had a different quality from the weeks before it. Something had been rearranged between us, nothing that could be pointed to and named, but present in the specific changes of small things. River began asking my opinion on treatments before she had decided on them, not because she needed the input, but because she was making space in the process for another person's thinking. I began anticipating what she would need in the mornings before she asked, and she stopped asking because the asking was no longer necessary. We fell into a working synchrony that I had no precedent for. I had worked with partners before in the Pinkerton years, the kind of professional partnership that functions on clear role division and mutual competence. This was different. This was the kind of working relationship that happens when two people have spent enough time in close proximity that they have begun to read each other below the level of deliberate communication. I knew when River was worried about an animal she was treating because she went quieter than usual, and her movements became even more precise, as if precision could substitute for certainty. I knew when she was tired because she started making the tea earlier in the evening. I knew when something I had done was correct, not from praise, which she offered rarely, but from the particular absence of correction which she offered without hesitation when it was warranted. She knew things about me, too. She knew when I had not slept because I was more careful with my words in the morning, choosing them individually rather than letting them come in the ordinary flow of conversation. She knew when I had been thinking about Daniel Reeves because I went to check on Dust at unusual hours, as if the animal's steady presence was a counterweight to something. She never said any of this aloud. Neither did I. But we knew it about each other, and we knew that the other person knew, and that mutual knowing was its own kind of language. Dust reached the point of full recovery on a Tuesday in the 3rd month. I watched him run the length of the enclosure that morning, his stride even and strong, the bad leg indistinguishable from the others, and I felt the complicated feeling that arrives when a thing you have been waiting and working for finally arrives and brings with it the question of what comes next. River was watching from the fence. She had that look she got when a difficult case resolved successfully, a small, contained satisfaction that did not announce itself but was completely unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at. "He's ready," she said. "I know," I said. We stood at the fence for a while without talking. Dust ran another lap and slowed to a walk and came over to push his nose against my arm in the particular greeting he had developed somewhere in the weeks of his recovery, a low-key announcement of his presence that was less demanding than a whinny and more reliable. I had 3 months ago told River that the arrangement would end when Dust was healed. Those had been her terms, and I had accepted them, and they were the terms we had both been operating under. There was no ambiguity in the structure of the agreement. What there was ambiguity in was everything the agreement had not accounted for. That evening, Old Thorne called a meeting of the settlement's council. I was not invited to attend, but the settlement was small enough that the fact of the meeting and its general subject were not secrets. There was a man coming. He was not a welcome visitor. The question before the council was what the settlement intended to do about the situation and about the man who had brought the situation with him. I sat outside with Dust in the cooling evening and listened to the sounds of the settlement around me and thought about what I was going to do. The practical situation was clear enough. Holt was coming. I had information that could put him in prison if it reached the right hands, but reaching those hands required a 3-day ride through open territory, and making that ride meant leaving the settlement exposed for at least 6 days, and I could not know with certainty whether those 6 days were inside or outside the window of Holt's arrival. There was a version of this where I left tonight, took Dust, who was healed enough to travel, and rode for Tucson. If Holt arrived while I was gone, there was nothing connecting me to the settlement except the account of a scout and the testimony of Silas. And Silas had made it clear since our conversation that he had no intention of providing any further assistance to Holt's people. By the time Holt confirmed I had been here and gone, I could already be in Tucson, already in front of the judge, already converting the notebook from a private record into a legal instrument. It was the clean version, the version with the least complicated geometry. I sat with it for a long time. Dust chewed his hay with the methodical patience of an animal who has learned that most human deliberation resolves itself eventually if you give it enough time. Then I thought about what River had said 3 weeks ago in the aftermath of the storm. Guilt is what you carry to punish yourself. Responsibility is what you carry to change something. I thought about the version of myself who had stood in Daniel Reeves's hallway and done the mathematics. I thought about how reasonable those mathematics had seemed at the time, the clean calculation of what was practical and what was not, what could be saved and what could not. I thought about Clara Reeves. I got up and went to find Old Thorne. He was still awake, which I had expected. He was a man who I had come to understand did not sleep until he had finished thinking through whatever the day had produced, and the day had produced considerable material for thinking. His structure was at the center of the settlement, larger than the others, with a fire kept going at the entrance that served as a kind of invitation. I sat across from it and waited, and after a few minutes he appeared in the entrance and looked at me with the assessing patience that was his characteristic expression. "I need your help," I said. "Not to save myself, to make sure Holt doesn't have a reason to come back here after I'm gone." He sat down. He looked at the fire. He said nothing, which I had learned was his way of indicating that I should continue. "If I go to Tucson alone," I said, I get the notebook to the judge and Holt gets arrested eventually if everything goes right. But eventually is not tonight, and it is not next week. And in the time between my leaving and the legal machinery doing what it does, Holt is going to arrive here, and there is going to be no one between him and this settlement except people who have nothing to do with any of this. Old Thorne said, "What would you have us do?" I told him. It was a practical plan, the kind that relies on geography and patience, rather than force, the kind that 6 years of field work had taught me to construct from available materials. The desert around the settlement had only 3 approaches that were viable for a group of riders. Controlling the horses meant controlling the approaches. Holt and his men could not cross that terrain on foot, not in this heat, not without water sources they did not know the location of. Old Thorne listened to all of it without expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You came here as a stranger. You stay as a man who asks us to take a risk on his behalf." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what I'm asking. Why should we do this?" I thought about all the answers available to me, the practical ones and the strategic ones and the ones that were about mutual interest and risk calculation. I thought about all the language I had available for making a request sound reasonable. I said, because River is part of this community and whatever Holt decides to do about loose ends, she is one of them. And because I am not willing to be the person who leaves that for someone else to deal with. Old Thorne looked at me across the fire for a long time. His face was very still and very attentive. The face of a man who has spent decades reading the difference between what people say and what they mean, and who has learned to wait for them to align before drawing conclusions. Then he said something that I was not prepared for. He said, "I sent a rider to Tucson 11 days ago. I looked at him. "The notebook in your saddlebag," he said. "You are careful with it. But you are not careful in the way of a man guarding a secret. You are careful in the way of a man guarding something important. I read it on the 2nd week after you arrived." I sat very still. "I am the leader of this community," he said without particular apology. "A man arrived here carrying a warrant and a history I did not know. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The notebook was available to me." "You sent a rider to Tucson with it," I said, "with a copy of the most relevant sections." The rider carried a letter explaining the situation and directing the judge's attention to the federal statutes most directly applicable to what Holt did. He also carried a description of Holt and an account of his movements over the past 8 months compiled from what you told River and what River told me. I looked at the fire. I am not sure what I was feeling exactly. Something with several layers to it, the outer layer being a kind of stunned blankness, and underneath it, something warmer that I did not immediately have a name for. "You trusted me," I said, "from the 2nd week." He considered the question. "I trusted what you did. There is a difference. I watched a man who had every reason to be careless about other people's property treat every animal in this settlement as if it mattered. I watched a man who had every reason to run, stay where he was, and do his work. Those are not the actions of a man who is calculating his options. Those are the actions of a man who has decided something." I said, "When did you decide to tell me this?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "When you came to me tonight not to ask for your own protection, but to ask for a way to protect the settlement." He paused. That was the confirmation I was waiting for. I sat with that. Outside the settlement was quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, Dust was moving slowly in his enclosure, the sound of his hooves in the soft ground a steady grounding rhythm. "What does the judge say?" I asked. Old Thorne reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it across the fire to me. "It arrived 3 days ago," he said. I opened it. The writing was official and formal, and it said what I had spent 8 months hoping to hear, that the evidence was sufficient, that a warrant had been issued for Warren Holt's arrest, that federal marshals had been dispatched, and that my cooperation in the formal proceedings would be required, but that my status as a material witness rather than a defendant had been established. My name was not on the wanted list anymore. Holt's was. I folded the paper and held it in my hands for a moment. I was not prepared for what the relief felt like. I had been carrying the weight of it for so long that I had forgotten what my own body felt like without it. And now it was gone all at once, and the absence of it was almost physical, like setting down something very heavy after a long walk and feeling the floor come up solid under your feet. "Thank you," I said. It came out quieter than I intended. Old Thorne said nothing. He looked at the fire with the expression of a man who has done what needed doing and does not require acknowledgement for it. I said, "You took a significant risk, if the judge had decided differently." "He had not decided differently," Old Thorne said simply. "I know how to read a situation." I looked at him. After a moment I said, "When did you know about River?" He looked at me without surprise at the question. "From the beginning. It is not something she has shown before. She is careful with everything, most of all with that." "I know," I said. He looked at the fire again. "She lost her father," he said. "The people she has allowed herself to depend on have a history of not remaining. It makes the allowing very difficult for her." "I understand that," I said. "I know you do," he said. "That is the other reason I waited." I walked back through the settlement in the dark, the folded letter in my coat pocket, the night air still and cool around me. The stars were out in the particular abundance that the desert produces on clear nights, dense and close-seeming, as if the sky had been brought down a few thousand feet closer than usual. I stopped at Dust's enclosure. He was awake, or he woke when I arrived, and he came to the fence and put his nose against my hand. "We need to talk," I told him. He breathed against my palm. "I am going to stay," I said. "After all this is finished, I am going to stay. Not because of the work, though the work is real. Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that is also true. Because this is the first place in a very long time where the things I do seem to matter in a way I can see. And because the person I have been working beside for 3 months is the most honest person I have encountered in my adult life, and because I have been running away from things for long enough that I have forgotten the difference between running from and running toward." Dust regarded me with his usual expression of patient, non-judgmental attention. "I know," I told him. "I'm aware that I am telling this to a horse. That is where we are." He huffed quietly against my hand. "I have to tell her first," I said. "Before any of it means anything, I have to tell her." I did not sleep that night. I lay in my structure and looked at the ceiling and listened to the settlement breathe around me the small sounds of a community in its nighttime quiet, and I thought about everything that was about to happen and everything I was going to have to say and do in the next 24 hours. By the time the sky began to lighten, I had made a list. It was not a written list. It was the kind of list that forms in a man's mind when he has been awake long enough for everything to get sorted into what matters and what doesn't, the irreducible sequence of what needs to happen in what order. First Holt, second everything else. Holt arrived with the morning. He came from the southeast approach, which was the one I had been least certain about, and he came with 4 men instead of the 6 that Silas had originally reported, which told me that 2 of them had been scouts who had already done their work and been released. He came on a good horse, riding at a pace that was confident without being rushed, the pace of a man who believes he has already won the important part and is arriving to collect. I was standing in the center of the settlement's open ground when he rode in. I had been standing there for 20 minutes. I had my hands visible, and I was not carrying anything except the letter from Judge Harrison in my coat pocket. He pulled up 20 feet from me and looked at me with the expression I remembered from 6 years of working beside him. Warren Holt was 51 years old, and he had spent 30 of those years in the kind of work that requires a man to make fast decisions in complicated situations and live with the consequences at whatever speed they arrive. He was good at his job. He had always been good at his job. The job had simply not required him until a certain Tuesday evening outside Flagstaff to be good at anything beyond the job. "Calloway," he said. His voice had the same particular quality it had always had, even, and controlled the voice of a man who considers display a waste of resources. "Holt," I said. He looked around the settlement with the professional sweep of a man assessing an environment for threats. He looked at the structures. He looked at the treatment area. He looked at the empty approaches on the north and west sides. He looked at the absence of his 4 men who had been quietly separated from their horses by Apache scouts sometime in the last 40 minutes while they were making their approach through the hill trails. His eyes came back to me. "You have been busy," he said. "You taught me that the preparation is the most important part," I said. "I learned it from watching you." Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect. Something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that passes between two people who know each other well enough to dispense with certain kinds of pretense. "The warrant," he said. "I assume you have dealt with that." I reached into my coat pocket and produced the letter from Judge Harrison. I held it up so he could see the seal. He looked at it for a long moment. His horse shifted under him. He stilled it with a slight pressure of his knees, an automatic practiced movement that he had probably not been aware of making. "The letter is from a federal judge in Tucson," I said. "The warrant for my arrest has been vacated. There is a new warrant. It has your name on it." He looked at me. "3 federal marshals are approximately 2 days behind you," I said. "They left Tucson when the judge received confirmation that you were moving toward this location. They know where you are, and they know where you are going." His jaw moved very slightly. I said, "There are 4 men with you. They are currently in a section of this territory without horses or water that they did not know how to avoid on the way in and will not know how to navigate on the way out. They are not in any danger if they stay where they are and wait, but they are not in a position to help you right now." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. It was the silence of a man doing mathematics. I recognized it because I had spent 6 years watching Holt do mathematics in difficult situations, and I had done some of my own in a hallway in Flagstaff, and the sound of it was something I would know anywhere. He was calculating what options remained. He was a thorough man, and he would go through all of them carefully before he reached the conclusion that I had already reached for him, which was that there were none. "Your family," I said. "I want you to know something." He looked at me. "What happens to you goes through the courts," I said. "You have a wife and 3 children in Philadelphia. None of them pulled that trigger in Flagstaff. None of them filed that false report. What happens to you is what the law decides. What happens to them is their own life, and I have not touched it and will not. The evidence I gave the judge is specific. It concerns what you did, your choices, no one else's. Whatever comes next for you, your wife, and your children are not part of it." He sat with that. Something in his face changed, a very small movement there and gone. "You could have used them," he said, "as leverage." "During the months you were putting this together?" "Yes," I said. "I know. Why didn't you?" "Because they are not responsible for what you did," I said. "And because using people who are innocent to get at people who are not is how this whole thing started." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter in my hand and at the settlement around us and at the empty approaches where his men were not visible. He dismounted. He was careful about it, the deliberate movements of a man making sure there was no ambiguity in what he was doing. He kept his hands visible. He stepped away from the horse. "I will wait for the marshals here," he said. I nodded. He sat down on the ground in the middle of the open space in the posture of a man who has made a decision and is done fighting the consequences of it. He looked old suddenly, not because anything had changed in his physical appearance, but because the quality of resistance had gone out of him, and what was left underneath it was simply a tired man who had been holding a thing together for a very long time and had finally set it down. I stood and watched him for a moment. I thought about Daniel Reeves. I thought about Clara Reeves and the 2 boys who had been old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to carry it the rest of their lives. I thought about what justice actually looked like when it arrived, whether it looked like anything at all, or whether it was just another ordinary morning with different paperwork. I put the letter back in my coat pocket. I went to find River. She was in the treatment area. She was always in the treatment area when there was uncertainty in the air. The work being the thing, she returned to the way other people return to familiar ground. She was checking on a mare that had come in 2 weeks ago with a respiratory problem, running her hands along the animal's chest with that complete, unhurried attention that I had first watched on a night that seemed very far away now. She looked up when I came in. "He is sitting in the middle of the settlement waiting for the marshals," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she went back to the mare, completing the examination she had been in the middle of. I stood near the fence and watched her work. "Old Thorne told me," I said. "About Tucson, about the rider he sent 11 days ago." She did not stop working. Her hands kept moving over the mare's chest, steady and precise. "He told you he read the notebook," she said. "Yes." "Did he tell you he asked me first?" she said. I went still. "Before he sent the rider," she said, "he came to me and asked whether he should. I told him yes." "You knew about the notebook," I said. "From the beginning," she said. "From the first week. I saw the way you kept track of it." She paused. "A man running from the law carries things he needs to survive: money, food, weapons. He does not carry a notebook with 6 years of careful notes unless the notes are the point." She finished with the mare and stepped back and looked at the animal with that assessing look. "I told Old Thorne to send the rider," she said, "because I had already decided I was not going to let you carry that alone anymore." She said it the way she said most things, without ceremony, as a fact being reported. But I had learned by then to hear the space around the words. She chose the larger thing that lived in what she did not say but meant. I said, "River." She looked at me. "I am not leaving," I said. "Not when dust healed, not when the marshals take Holt, not after the legal proceedings finish. I am staying here. Not because of the work, though I want to keep doing the work. Not because I have made some calculation about what is practical. Because this is where I want to be. Because you are here." She was very still. "I know we agreed to something different when this started," I said, "and I know I do not have the right to ask you to set that agreement aside just because I want something it does not include. So I am not asking for an answer right now. I am telling you what is true, and I am telling you that whatever you decide, I will not make it harder than it already is." She looked at me for a long time. The mare moved behind her, the soft sound of the animal's breathing steady in the quiet. Then River said, "When your structure was being prepared the first night you arrived, I was the one who chose which structure to give you. I waited. I chose the one closest to mine," she said. "I told myself it was for practical reasons, because of the work, because of the distances involved in the treatment schedules." She looked at me steadily. I knew that was not the whole reason, she said. I knew it then. I chose not to examine it very closely. The morning light was moving across the treatment area in the way it moved in early autumn, clear and long, and without the violence of summer. The mare shifted her weight. Somewhere in the settlement, ordinary life was beginning its ordinary morning. "You have been alone for a long time," I said. "So have you," she said. "I know." She looked at me. I looked at her. The space between us was very small and entirely full of everything that had accumulated in 3 months of working and talking and sitting through storms and building something out of silence and careful attention. She said, "I am afraid of this." "I know," I said. "I am too." She said, "My father used to say that the things worth having are not the ones that arrive without cost." "What did he mean by that?" I said. "I think he meant that the fear is part of it," she said. "That if you are not afraid, you probably do not care enough about what you might lose." I said nothing. She was right, and there was nothing to add to it. She looked at the mare for a moment, then she looked back at me. "The paper marriage," she said. "It is still technically in effect." "I know." "I do not want to dissolve it," she said. "I want to keep it. But not the way it is now, not for the reasons it was made." I said, "What reasons would you keep it for?" She met my eyes. "The real ones," she said. I stood in the morning light of the treatment area with the woman who had saved my horse and somewhere in the process had done something else entirely that I had been slower to understand, and I thought about all the miles between who I had been when I arrived here and who I was standing in this moment, and I thought about my mother asking what I was going to do with my life, and I thought about Daniel Reeves and the lantern, and I thought about all the moments I had stood still when movement was the only honest thing available life, and whether any of them had led me anywhere as real as this particular morning. I said, "All right." She nodded once the single definitive nod that I had learned meant a decision had been fully made and required no further discussion. Then she turned back to the mare and continued her work, and I went to the supply area and began preparing the morning's medicines, and the settlement moved around us in its ordinary rhythms, the sounds of a community at work in the early light. Later that morning, Silas found me at the fence where I was watching Dust run his morning circuit of the enclosure. He stood beside me without speaking for a while. Dust completed 2 circuits and slowed to a walk and came over to press his nose against the rail. "I am sorry," Silas said, "for what I told Holtzman. I did not understand what I was putting in motion." "I know," I said. He looked at Dust. "You are staying?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. Then, without any particular transition, "There is a fence section on the eastern boundary that needs the posts replaced before winter. I told old Thorne I would organize it. I could use someone who knows what they are doing with the heavy work." I said, "I am available." He nodded. He looked at the mare's enclosure where River was visible through the fence, moving through her morning routine with the focused competence that was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. He looked at her the way a younger brother looks at an older sister, when he thinks no one is paying attention, with an uncomplicated and genuine affection that has survived everything it has had to survive. "She is better," he said. "I don't mean with the animals. She has always been good with the animals." "I understand what you mean," I said. He glanced at me sideways. She would not say that herself. She would say, "Nothing has changed." "Probably not," I said. "But it has," he said. "Something in the way she moves, something in the way she is in the mornings now." He left it there and went back to his work, and I watched Dust for a while longer in the morning light. 2 days after Holt was taken by the federal marshals, a letter arrived for me from Tucson. Inside was an official notification of my status as a material witness, a date for the formal proceedings, and a separate note in a different hand that turned out to be from Judge Harrison himself. 3 lines that said simply that the evidence was thorough and well organized and that he appreciated the difficulty of what it had cost to preserve it. I showed it to River that evening. She read it and handed it back and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Write to your mother tonight." I looked at her. "You have been carrying her worry as well as your own," she said. "Let her put hers down." I sat down that evening and wrote the letter I had been drafting and not sending for 3 months. I wrote it all the way through for the first time without stopping to calculate what to include and what to manage, without the particular careful distance that fear imposes on the things you say to the people who matter most. I told my mother where I was and what I had done and what was coming next and what I was going to do after that. I folded into the envelope the last wages I had drawn from the Pinkerton agency before I resigned. I had been carrying that money for 2 years without spending it, which told me something about what I had believed I deserved. I put it in without a note about what it was. She would understand. At the end I wrote, "I found something worth staying for." I think you would understand what I mean by that. I think you always understood more about what I was looking for than I did myself. Old Thorne held a gathering at the end of that week. It was not a dramatic ceremony, nothing with speeches or formal declaration. It was simply the community coming together in the evening the way communities come together when something has shifted and everyone knows it, and the gathering is the acknowledgement. He said my name in front of the settlement. He said that I had come as a stranger and stayed as something else, and that the community's judgment of a person was made not by where they arrived from, but by what they chose to do when the choice was not easy, and that by that measure I had made my case. I stood and listened to him say it, and I thought about every place I had been in 32 years, every town and trail and case and night under open sky, and I thought about how none of them had felt like this. Not because this was perfect or simple or free of the ordinary complications that come with being a human being among other human beings, but because it was real in the specific way that places are real when you have chosen them freely with your eyes open, knowing what the choice costs, and making it anyway. That night River and I sat at the edge of the settlement in the cooling autumn air and watched the stars come out over the desert. We sat close enough that I was aware of the warmth of her beside me in the dark. "The paper marriage," she said after a while. I waited. "I told old Thorne this morning," she said, "that I want to make it real, officially, with the words said properly and the reason said clearly." I looked at her. She looked at the stars. He said the words can be said whenever we are ready. There is no particular ceremony required, just the intention stated in front of witnesses. When would you like to do that? I said. She turned and looked at me with those dark, steady eyes that had looked straight at my arrest warrant on the first night and kept right on working. She looked at me the way she had looked at that first photograph of Daniel Reeves, completely and without flinching, seeing what was actually there. Soon she said, "I have been patient for a long time about many things. I am not interested in being patient about this." I said, "I am not going anywhere." "I know," she said. "That is why I am not being patient about it." She turned back to the stars. After a moment, her shoulder came to rest against mine. A small, deliberate thing, completely intentional. The gesture of a person who has made a decision and is acting on it without announcement or apology. I sat with her in the dark and looked at the desert sky and thought about Dust standing in a Colorado corral 3 years ago with his head hanging and his expectations already surrendered, waiting to see what got decided. I thought about a woman who had spent 5 years sitting alone at the edge of this settlement, looking west with her shoulders holding something too large for shoulders. I thought about what it meant to stop running. Not the giving up kind of stopping. The other kind where you arrive somewhere and you know it for what it is and you set your things down and you stay. Dust made a sound from the enclosure across the way, a quiet, low sound. Nothing urgent, just the sound of an old horse registering the presence of his person and finding it satisfactory. "I heard him," I said quietly to no one in particular. River said nothing. Her shoulder stayed warm against mine. Above us, the stars continued their patient, indifferent wheeling, the same as they had been every night of my life, and would be long after, and below them, the desert settled into its nighttime self. And inside that settling, 2 people sat together in the specific, ordinary way of people who have finally stopped having reasons not to. That was enough. After everything, that was more than enough. That was everything.